At 3:41 a.m., false signals filled the radar. Screens lit up with noise as operators tried to tell what was real and what wasn't. The northern terminal sat under hard lights, its cranes and pipelines cut into the night like a city of metal. Two large carriers were mid-transfer, lines humming as thick liquid moved on the slow current. It was the same current that fed many contracts and schedules beyond the quay. Inside the operations room, displays showed steady flow, valves aligned, and staff working the same checks they always ran. The place read as routine, a hub of movement and waiting, a junction of calendars and cargo. At 1:15 a.m., small machines began to leave their shelter in the dark, far away to the north. They rose in a pattern that was not random. The departures were paced, regular, the kind of cadence learned by practice. Within minutes, a formation had taken to the air, a low, relentless presence on the edge of radar and sky. Each craft carried the purpose of its design. They moved in groups, spreading into three main routes that would converge on the same point: the port. The approach was quiet where it needed to be and visible where it could be. One set of craft climbed to catch attention, another set stayed low and out of clear sight. The pattern was a choice of attention, to make something obvious and let other things move without being noticed. Systems on the ground recorded early blips and then went back to steady lines. For a time, the night's normal cadence swallowed the anomaly. By 3:41 a.m., a different element entered the picture. An orbiting sensor, tasked in its mission to watch and report, was turned to create noise rather than clarity. For several minutes, monitors picked up false returns that cluttered screens and forced operators to ask whether what they were seeing was real. The false cloud of signals moved like a phantom, pulling focus and making the sky look busy with things that were not there. While attention was drawn to that shifting pattern, the main body of small craft continued its low passage, threading through the gaps left by the confusion overhead. At 4 a.m., as the formation drew near the coastal approaches, a deliberate change occurred. A handful of machines climbed and transformed from quiet silhouettes into bright, obvious signatures. They were meant to look like larger threats. They were meant to be seen. On the screens, the sudden bright contacts triggered alerts and reoriented defensive attention. Sensors that had been scanning for small, fast movement were now tracking the obvious and loud. This, in the moment, was the point: to shift response to the visible while other elements closed the distance unseen. By 4:08 a.m., the visible contacts were engaged. Systems launched interceptors and defensive measures against the clear targets. For the operators on duty, the work was immediate and mechanical. Matches were made to tracks, boxes checked, firing sequences begun. In the forest beyond the coast, fragments and wreckage fell. The local command recorded success and cleared the alarm. 5 high-visibility contacts were dealt with, no continuing threat from those particular blips. The certainty of that success was part of the plan. It reduced the pressure on the true approaching danger. At 4:17 a.m., the low-lying elements crossed a lake and moved into a corridor between sectors. On ground displays, their signatures were faint, smeared by terrain and clutter. They used the features the landscape offered, lines of trees, river bends, and inlets, as references when satellite fixes were unreliable. They carried no regular radio chatter that would make them easy to intercept. They were, for all practical purposes, on the screens, almost invisible. The defense systems noted nothing to correlate into a single, coherent picture. At 4:22 a.m., a duty officer saw a small, intermittent return on his console. The blip was ambiguous, slow, low, irregular. It might have been a bird or a momentary sensor hiccup. Procedures call for caution when the data are uncertain, and that caution costs time. Elsewhere, other low returns made their own faint marks. The defenders weighed whether to open fire on a possible illusion or to wait for confirming tracks. The delay, measured in seconds, allowed the formation to maintain approach and conserve the element of surprise. At 4:27 a.m., what had been scattered and faint coalesced into a pattern. Multiple low-level contacts began closing from 3 directions toward the terminal. Controllers expanded monitoring, reallocated resources, and raised alert levels. The situation became clearer and more urgent. The screen, which had been a quiet map, turned into a dense set of converging vectors. Batteries that had been held in reserve were brought forward. Operators began the sequence that reads one threat against another. At 4:44 a.m., the last wave descended. The units that had kept to the sea's surface and the low horizon altered course and split their assigned objectives across the facility, the operations center, the pump fields, and the berths with the largest carriers. The idea was not to concentrate fire on a single point, but to hit the nodes the port depended on, where coordination lived, where power met control, where transfers were managed. In a matter of moments, multiple systems would be assaulted in parallel. At 4:45 a.m. and 12 seconds, the first impacts struck. One craft struck an operations building where servers and human controllers coexisted, the burst of force severing lines and frying electronics. A second hit a transfer valve room on the pier, rupturing seals and letting pressurized flows surge uncontrolled. A third struck a ship's intake systems, punching through critical plumbing and weakening the vessel's ability to manage its own systems. In those seconds, pressures spiked and then collapsed. Valves that were meant to close under emergency commands stuck open or failed to respond to the dead control room. The compound effect was immediate. Fire, flash, and sudden loss of coordinated control. Within the next minute, chain reactions unfolded. Ruptured lines spilled product that caught, spread, and fed flames across the pier. Secondary explosions occurred where vapors found ignition points. Floating pools of fuel burned with a white-hot intensity that warped metal. The transfer pumps, built for steady flow and heavy duty, were not designed to withstand impacts that blew apart their housings. Control circuits fused. Backups could not be brought online because the control logic that initiated them had been destroyed or isolated. In the course of 2 minutes, the facility's central pumping hub suffered catastrophic structural failure. Pressure vessels ruptured, support structures gave way. Systems that orchestrated the movement of product were rendered blind. The carriers at the quay were compromised. Fires raced along decks, damage to engine rooms cut off. Power to pumps and transfer hoses came free under abnormal loads. The port's visible face changed from an organized choreography into a fractured tangle of flames and collapsed metal. Firefighting crews arrived and found their normal procedures made meaningless by the scale and speed of the damage. Hoses and foam units could not reach certain zones because of heat and secondary blast risk. Safety commanders ordered evacuations of non-essential zones, sealed perimeter gates, and radioed for additional assistance. A command post was moved to a redundant location, but the redundancy itself had limits. Effective coordination needs data, and data feeds had been severed at the source. The thermal picture from overhead within the next hour showed multiple hot points, 2 main infernos, and several satellite fires across storage fields and transfer nodes. Smoke rose in thick columns that turned the early morning light into a dull orange haze. Crews working the edges of the fires kept away from central zones where structural collapse and reignition were most likely. Damage spread faster than containment could be organized. Throughout the event, defenders recorded what they could: a pattern of simultaneous effects, an overload of alarms, and a rapid loss of links between detection and action. The visible signs of response, missile launches, rotating guns, and defensive bursts consumed resources and created their own pattern of waste. High-cost defensive assets were expended on obvious targets, while smaller, low-cost attackers delivered the critical hits across multiple nodes. In the immediate aftermath, operators and analysts mapped the timeline in careful strokes. Each action was logged, but the logs showed something other than a single mistake. They showed a sequence of deliberate choices timed to exploit gaps where systems and humans interact. The attackers had made the defenders choose where to focus. The defenders, bound by procedure and limited by what their senses could clearly show, had to commit to one thread and let others pass. Technical notes that emerged in those logs were plain in their lessons. When primary sensors registered overwhelming noise, human operators and automated filters were forced into triage. When key control rooms were disabled, fallback systems required manual re-engagement that could not be completed under fire. When mechanical redundancies were damaged at the same time as control redundancies, the chance of complete functional collapse rose dramatically. The event showed that interdependent systems failed together when hit at their coupling points. By the time the worst of the flames was contained, the key had been transformed, structural supports had buckled, control panels were charred, piping networks had been severed, 2 large carriers were lost as effective transfer platforms. The port's transfer capability was effectively halted. For operations staff, the damage was not just physical loss, but a removal of the ability to know and to control, the essential functions that let a complex site breathe and operate. The human toll of the night was not something the machines could measure directly. Crews worked under smoke and heat. Several were injured. Some required evacuation. Emergency medical teams treated burns and shock. The accounts from those who had been on duty described a sudden, violent change, from routine to survival in a handful of minutes. Safety procedures saved lives. Redundancy and training allowed many to withdraw to safe zones. Still, the psychological impact, the sense of a place that could be suddenly made unsafe in the dark, lingered in every log entry and debrief note. In the hours that followed, the technical picture clarified. The pattern of disruptions fit together, a diversion of attention, clear expendable targets engaged by the defense, and the quiet arrival of the elements whose purpose was to damage the site's nodes of control. The record did not need romantic phrasing to show intent. The sequence was methodical: distraction, redirection, breach, and paralysis. That sequence, recorded in timestamps and sensor reports, is the kind that analysts teach to watch for. Multiple touch points, synchronized to create cascading failures. The facility's backups and contingency plans mitigated some outcomes and failed in others. Redundant servers that might have accepted control handoffs were themselves isolated when the primary control cluster was taken offline. Local generator arrays started as designed, but the transition between utility feed and backup power required time that the damaged systems did not always permit. Hydraulic systems and pressure relief mechanisms engaged where possible, but several key valves had been physically destroyed in the initial strikes and could not be commanded to a safe state. Containment teams worked to harden what they could, closing manual valves, erecting temporary dams where piping had ruptured, and rerouting foam systems to choke the main heat sources. Engineers climbed into damaged consoles, burning fingers, replacing chips, and patching cables because automated transitions had been rendered useless. The work was dirty and immediate, repair by hand in the face of heat and risk. Within a few hours, the scene stabilized enough for a basic assessment. Satellite imagery and overhead thermal readings confirmed the on-site observations: 2 core infernos and a handful of secondary fires. The port's layout, once known to operators by habit, now looked like a map of loss. Missing pieces where structures had been torn aside, blackened strips where piping had failed, and areas where recovery would have to start from the foundations. The human reports filled in the rest. Night crews who had scrambled, managers who had rerouted assets, and safety teams that had counted off personnel. What the event laid bare was not simply the physical damage, but the way modern systems interlock. The operation exploited the seams, the moments where detection shifts to decision, where automatic control hands over to manual intervention, and where one mechanical failure can ripple through an entire logistics chain. The attack did not use high-cost or complex tools alone. It used timing and sequence to make costly defenses irrelevant. Lessons were recorded in formal after-action notes. Intelligence and operations analysts drew clean lines between the diversionary effects and the real impacts. Redundancy that only existed in software or in idealized failover paths was insufficient when the physical nodes of control were destroyed. Human procedures that assumed alerts would be consistent and separable were strained by overlapping, simultaneous failures. Those realities drove a simple conclusion: defense is as much about managing the structure of interdependence as it is about having strong individual components. Practical recommendations followed in the logbooks. Harden physical control nodes so that they cannot be taken out by a single strike. Distribute time critical. If you found this deep dive into the Primorsk strike as intense as we did, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't miss the next story. Join the mission now.